You may be seated. Good morning. My name is Anna Merrill, and I have the privilege of reading the scripture for you today. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel, where he had set up a monument for himself. Then he turned around and went down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to him, Saul said, "May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." Samuel replied, "Then what is the sound of sheep and goats and cattle I hear?" Saul answered, "The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep, goats, and cattle in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest were destroyed." "Stop," exclaimed Samuel. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." "Tell me," he replied. Samuel continued, "Although once you considered yourself unimportant, haven't you become the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you the king over Israel and sent you on a mission and said, 'Go, completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you annihilated them.' So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what is evil in the Lord's sight?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul answered. "I went on the mission, and the Lord gave me, and brought back the king of Agag of Amalek, and completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops took sheep, goats, and cattle up from the plunder, the best what was set apart for destruction to sacrifice the Lord your God at Gilgal." Then Samuel said, "Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey the Lord is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than a fat of rams. For rebellion is like a sin of divination, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Saul answered Samuel, "I have sinned. I have transgressed the Lord's command and your words. Because I was afraid of the people, I obeyed them. Now therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so I can worship the Lord." Samuel replied to Saul, "I will not return with you because you have rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel."
Thanks, Anna. Well, it is great to be with you today. If you have a copy of the scriptures, go ahead to that passage. You'll find it in the first portion called the Old Testament in a writing called 1 Samuel, and we're going to be in chapter 15. And if you don't have a copy of the scriptures, by the way, I'd love to help you with that. Come see me after the service. I'll make sure to get you hooked up with something like that. Today, we're continuing a series we've been in for a couple weeks now where we're looking at what it means for God that we as Christians believe that Jesus is our King, and then what it means for us to live in his kingdom. And what we want to look at today is that what it means for us to follow Jesus as our King, part of how we can choose him as our King is to be obedient to him, to do the things that he asks us to do in our lives. Now, I know that that seems simple and, well, just maybe obvious, but it really isn't, and we see it in our text, where at this point in the biblical story, God's people called the Israelites are ruled by a king named Saul, and Saul is supposed to rule God's people on God's behalf. And normally what I do to start our conversations together is I kind of lay the groundwork for where we're going to go. I don't think I need to do that today because I think the text does it for us, where the Lord comes to Saul and he gives him a command. And you can see what that command is in verse 18, where it says, "The Lord anointed you king over Israel and then sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them.'" That's a difficult text to read, isn't it? Why is God ordering the annihilation of an entire people group? Now, by the way, that's one of those questions that we're looking for in that series coming up in January, because you could spend an entire sermon on that. You could spend a couple of sermons on that if you really wanted to. And so if that's a question that you wrestle with, would love for you to submit that, and we can talk about it in January. But for our purposes this morning, let me just say this. The Amalekites were an extremely violent people. They were committing atrocities that I don't think we as 21st century Western people could wrap our minds around. They were committing genocide. They were burning their children alive as sacrifices to their gods. They were marauders. And so what God does is he comes to Saul and he says, "I want you and my people to be the agent of divine justice that is going to come on the Amalekites for their violence and for their atrocities." But what's really interesting, you have to catch this, is that God tells Saul he must do it in a different way. We didn't read this, but if you read verses 1 through 9, you'll see that God comes to Saul and he says, I want you to go and fight the Amalekites, but you are not to take a thing from the battle. And this would have been weird because in the ancient Near East, the reason you went to war was so that you could benefit from it as a people. They weren't just killing each other for the sake of killing. They would go to war so that they could get more land, they could get more stuff, more money, they could get some slave labor so they wouldn't have to work as hard. The purpose of war in the ancient Near East was so that your people could get better off than at the expense of other people around you. And what God does is he comes to Saul, and you can see this in verse 9. We didn't read this, Samuel 15, chapter 1, verse 9. It says, Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the goats, the cattle, and choice animals, as well as the young rams and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. Verse 9 tells us that Saul wages war like everybody else does. He comes against the Amalekites as an act of imperialism when God came to him and said, you're not to benefit a cent from this. You are to be my agent of truth, my agent of justice against the violence and darkness of this world, and you don't get to benefit from it at all. But Saul didn't listen. He reverts back to what everybody else around him was doing, and in an act of violence and imperialism, destroys the Amalekites the way that everybody else would. He forsakes his role as the king of Israel, who's supposed to keep Israel as a light to the nations that looks different from everybody else. And at the heart of Saul's failure is disobedience. A lack of willingness to be obedient to what God asked him to do. And the same dynamic exists for any of us today who call ourselves followers of Jesus. And so what I want to do with this text is I want us to look at it, and I want us to discover three things when it comes to obedience. I want us to discover the difficulty of obedience, one key to obedience in our lives, and the importance of obedience. So let's do that. Let's look at this text, and let's discover together the difficulty of obedience, one of the keys to obedience in our lives, and then let's look at the importance of obedience. Let's start with the difficulty of obedience. Can we just be honest enough this morning to say that obedience is hard? That is something that doesn't come natural to us as human beings. Obedience is something that needs to be taught and learned by us as human beings, and the same is true when it comes to God. Saul gets a direct command from the Lord about what he's supposed to do, and he has a lot of difficulty obeying it, and so much difficulty that he doesn't obey it. And I think there are reasons why obedience is so difficult for us. One of them is that sometimes obedience just doesn't make sense. The reason I spent some time on that cultural background that we just did was to show you just how insane God's command would have seemed to Saul. The reason you go to war is so that you can benefit from it as a king and as a people. That's just the way that you did things. And so when God comes to Saul and says, you're going to war, but you're not going to benefit at all, it just wouldn't have made sense. It would have made so little sense that Saul would have really struggled to be obedient. And I think if we're honest, the same thing is true as followers of Jesus, where sometimes Jesus' commands don't make sense to us, which makes it really difficult to obey. Let me give you an example. In the second portion of the scriptures called the New Testament, we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life written for us by his closest friends and followers. And in one of those accounts, Matthew records 2 different teachings for us, 2 commands of Jesus. And the first one he records for us is in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says that if you are his follower and you realize that someone else has something against you because you've done something to them, you need to go and reconcile. You need to go and make things right. So again, if I realize that one of you has something against me because I did something to wrong you, Jesus' command on my life as a follower of Jesus and on your life, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, is that you would go and reconcile with that person. Then later on in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says, his command for those of us who follow him is that if someone wrongs you, you're responsible to go and reconcile with them. You're responsible to go and talk with them about it and make that situation right. So again, if I do something to wrong you, or you do something to wrong someone else, the command on my life as a follower of Jesus and on your life as a follower of Jesus is that we would go to the person who wronged us and make things right. So essentially what Jesus does in Matthew 5 and Matthew 18 is he says that any time there's any wrong between you and another person, whether you caused it or not, the initiative is on you to reconcile. Does that make sense? Because I think for a lot of us, we might struggle with, like, Matthew chapter 5. I mean, if they have a problem with me, they should come talk, like they should follow Matthew 18, right? I can't spend my life worrying about whether I've wronged all of these people or not. Like I can't be walking around and making sure that everybody's okay with me all the time. That command doesn't make any sense. Wait, what do you mean that if somebody wrongs me, like what do you mean that if I wrong somebody, that I have to go and make it right? Shouldn't they come talk to me about them being wronged? Like, do you see how this can work? Where the commands of Jesus, the commands that the scriptures give us on our lives don't make sense to us, and that makes it difficult to obey them. Another reason that obedience is so difficult is because sometimes it won't benefit us. Obedience is difficult because there's not always a payoff to it. You can see Saul wrestle with this. He struggles with obedience here because he's not going to benefit from it. Look at verse 12. It says, early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel where he set up a monument for himself. Who's the only one that Saul, excuse me, I'm going to do that all morning, forgive me. Who's the only one that Saul should be making monuments to? The Lord, right? And yet, he makes a monument to himself. Why? Because he wants to benefit. He wants to benefit from his obedience. He wants the fame and the glory and the honor that comes from his victory. This is why he spares King Agag, by the way, because it was typical in the ancient Near East that when one people group defeated another, the victorious king would parade around the conquered and defeated king as a way to bring himself glory and honor and put the other king to shame. Saul was asked to be obedient without there being any benefit for him, and he struggled because of that. And I think you and I struggle in the same way. I see this in my kids all of the time. If there is a benefit to my kids being obedient to me, to doing what I ask them to do, they're much more willing to do it. But if I ask them to do something simply because I'm asking them to do it, they're not quite as willing as when there's a payoff for it. And the same is true for me. When I'm asked to be obedient to different things, even Jesus in my life, if I can't see a way that I benefit from it, it becomes difficult for me to be obedient. If there's no payoff to obedience, there's times where we question whether it's worth it or not. And then the third reason that it's difficult to be obedient that we see in our text goes hand in hand in that is that not only will obedience not benefit us sometimes, there's a possibility that at times being obedient to Jesus in your life will cost you. It'll cost you. If you look at verse 24, Saul says, because I was afraid of the people, I obeyed them. Saul realizes that if he doesn't take the spoils of war, not only does he not benefit, but it might cost him his kingship. Because the people of Israel would have been expecting him to take spoils of war. They would have expected to benefit themselves from the slave labor, from all of the stuff that they would get from their victory. And Saul realizes that if he doesn't do that, it could cost him. It could cost him their respect. It could cost him their following. It could even see them revolt against him as their king. And because of the cost of obedience, Saul refuses. That's why, as your pastor, I refuse to lie to you. Like, there are lots of people out there who try to paint following Jesus as this just constantly beneficial thing for your life, and it's just not true. There are times where being obedient to Jesus might cost you. It might cost you a relationship. It might cost you a job or a promotion. There are even people all over the world right now that obedience to Jesus might cost them their lives. And so we struggle with whether we're willing to pay the cost of obedience. Obedience isn't easy. It's a struggle for us because a lot of times what Jesus commands of us doesn't make sense. It's a struggle because it feels like we won't benefit from being obedient to him, and then it's even more of a difficulty because there are times where being obedient to Jesus will cost us. And so my question for you, like the first thing I want you to think about today is, are you struggling with one of these things in your own life? Are there commands of Jesus that you struggle to be obedient to because it doesn't make sense to you, because you don't see the benefit, or you're not willing to pay the cost? Because let's just be honest again. Being obedient to Jesus in our current cultural moment is difficult. It's not easy. I mean, it's difficult to be obedient to what Jesus has to say about how we should use and view our bodies or value the lives of the unborn, because in our culture, those things just don't make sense. It's difficult to be obedient to Jesus' command on our lives to give to the poor or to care for the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant or foreigner, because that kind of thing doesn't seem to benefit us, really. In fact, it'll cost us in the long run if we're obedient to those commands. And that's not to mention the myriad of other commands that Jesus gives us in our lives that I could bring up. Is there a command or multiple commands in your life, in your relationship with Jesus, that you struggle with being obedient to because of one of these things? Now, if there is, then it's important for us to talk about one of the keys to being obedient despite that difficulty, because despite all of the difficulty there is with obedience, we can still do it. We can still be obedient to Jesus, and we see one of the keys to doing that in Saul's life. There's something really important that we need to recognize about all of this discussion. We will be disobedient. There are times in your life where you are not going to follow Jesus' commands. And Jesus knew that before he saved you. Like, he knew when he saved you that you were going to continue to mess this up. More on that here in a second. But what I want us to see here is that the key to obedience, one of them, is not just striving. It's not just trying to follow after Jesus, which is a good thing to do. It's not just setting up systems and accountability and community to help us with that, which is another good thing to do. There's another key, and that is about how we respond when we mess up. Look at verse 13. Samuel comes to Saul, and Saul says, "May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." This is just a fascinating moment. Because Saul says, I've been obedient, when he hasn't. Like, just put yourself in Saul's shoes for a second. You see Samuel coming, knowing that he's God's representative, and you know you've been disobedient, so you try to head him off with the pass. You're like, hey, I've done what the Lord asked of me. Well, when you know you haven't, and so Samuel calls him out on this. He says in verse 14, "Then what is this sound of sheep, goats, and cattle I hear?" Saul is caught. He's been found out in his disobedience. How do you respond when that happens to you? Like, when you're caught, when you're found out, how do you typically respond? Look at how Saul does. Saul answered, "The troops brought them." The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep and goat and cattle in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest were destroyed. Saul is confronted about his disobedience, and he blame shifts. He says, oh, it wasn't me, it was them. It was the soldiers who brought those things. Instead of owning up to his disobedience, he blame shifts. You ever find yourself doing that? You know, I would follow Jesus' command on my life to forgive that person for what they've done, but they're just so unforgivable. Like, they're so terrible. They've never asked for my forgiveness. I mean, it's their fault that I can't forgive them. I would follow Jesus' command on my life to be more generous if I had more things to be generous with, but I don't, so I can't follow after that. We blame shift instead of owning up to our disobedience. We make it everybody else's problem instead of our own. And one of the things I want you to be aware of is a way that we do that seems like we're taking ownership when we're really not. You don't really see this in Saul. He just completely blame shifts. But what we'll do is we will kind of own what we're doing by saying, yeah, I did that, I was wrong, but I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for this. So one of the places this happens a lot in my life is when it comes to driving. I live with this mentality that if everybody else drove the way I did, the world would just be a better place. You with me on that? Any of you agree? Right. And so there are times where I'm driving, and driving is one of the least sanctified areas of my life. The Lord and I are working on this, where someone else will do something and I will respond. I will say something in the car, I will do something in response, or I will think something, and I'll be there, I'll think about it, and I'll go, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have said it. I certainly shouldn't have thought what I thought in that moment. But I wouldn't have done it if they wouldn't have cut me off. I wouldn't have done it if they weren't driving 5 miles an hour under the speed limit. Yeah, I messed up, but it wasn't me. It wasn't my responsibility. They're the ones to blame. If we're not careful and we are caught in disobedience, we blame shift. And Samuel's having none of it from Saul. He tells Saul to stop. He confronts him some more, and Saul still won't own his disobedience. He says in verse 20, again, he says, I did obey the Lord. And then look at what he says in verse 21. He says, the troops took all of that plunder, and the reason they took it, watch this, is to sacrifice to the Lord at Gilgal. Saul justifies his actions. He says, they took them, but they took them to worship. It's okay. Like, we were disobedient, but we were disobedient so that we could worship the Lord, so that makes it fine. Like he justifies it. Later, he's going to do this again when he says, the reason I was disobedient is because I was afraid of the people. And we do this all the time. Yeah, I might have been disobedient to Jesus. I might have been disobedient to my boss, but guess what? I had good intentions. I was trying to do something good when I was disobedient. I would have been obedient to what God asked me to do, but there were these extenuating circumstances that made obedience impossible. I'm pretty sure the Lord will understand. Instead of taking ownership, we justify our actions, and then look at what Saul does last. This whole time, he's refused to admit his disobedience until he hears from Samuel in verse 23 that the Lord has rejected him as king, and look at how he responds. I have sinned. I've transgressed the Lord's command and your words because I was afraid of the people. I obeyed them. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so I can worship the Lord. Here's what just happened. There are times where my kids will be found out in a moment of disobedience, and I will go to them to confront them in that, and all I'm trying to do is get them to confess it. All I'm trying to do is get them to own up to their disobedience, but in that moment, they will blame shift. They will say they didn't do it, and my wife didn't do it, and I didn't do it, and neither did their sibling. And so apparently there's an imaginary person living in our house who's doing random things around the house. They'll blame shift to say they didn't do it. They'll justify their actions to try to explain it away as it wasn't being disobedient. And I'll finally get to the point where I'll say, okay, you're blame shifting, you're justifying, you don't want to confess and take ownership. So here are the consequences for your actions, and everything changes in an instant. All of a sudden, they're really sorry. They're confessing to the stuff that I confronted them about and stuff that I didn't confront them about. They're talking about how awesome they think I am. And it's not because they're actually sorry. It's not because they're actually trying to confess, and it's not because they actually think I'm awesome. They're doing it because they don't like the consequences. They don't want to experience the results of their actions, and that's exactly what Saul is doing here. He refuses to take any kind of ownership until all of a sudden he realizes the consequences of his actions, and then he's sorry. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there's a similar story about another king of God's people named David in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, where, based on our perspective, you could argue that David does something way worse than Saul. He commits adultery with another man's wife, gets her pregnant, and then covers it up by murdering her husband. And God does the same thing he did with Saul. He sends a representative named Nathan to confront David in his sin. The difference is that David owns it. He confesses right away in that moment. He doesn't blame shift. He doesn't justify his actions. In fact, he uses the exact same phrase that Saul does. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And David gets to keep the kingship while Saul loses it. Because David was willing to own it. David was willing to confess his sin. The only reason Saul confessed is because he didn't like the consequences of his actions. And so one of the keys to being obedient to Jesus in your life is that when you're not, you own it. You take full responsibility for it and you confess your sin to Jesus, because you have to remember, he's not mad at you. He's not disappointed in you. He's not waiting to get you. In fact, he's inviting you to come to him to confess and to take ownership so that you can find the grace and the forgiveness you need to move on in the strength he has for you to change whatever that behavior is in your life. Because the important thing you have to remember is that Jesus didn't save you because of your obedience. It's so easy to... Did you notice the gospel in our passage? It's so easy to miss, but look at it with me in verse 17. Watch this. Samuel's saying this to Saul. He says, you thought yourself small, unimportant, and yet you've become the leader of the tribes of Israel. And then he says this, the Lord anointed you king over Israel. Notice that the Lord made Saul king without Saul earning it. Like Saul didn't have anything going for him that nobody else did, except for the fact that he was a little bit taller and he was good looking. And the Lord didn't come to him and say, Saul, here's all of the things I want you to be obedient to, and if you do a good enough job, I'll make you king. He chooses Saul as king sheerly out of God's grace, and the same is true for us. Jesus doesn't save us, praise his holy name, by coming to us and saying, here's all the things you've got to do to be obedient, and maybe I'll save you if you do well enough. We're saved by God's grace alone through placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And if that's the case, your disobedience to Jesus can be solved by you actually owning your disobedience, by owning it at first, placing your trust in Jesus and his work for you on the cross, and then continuing to take ownership as you move forward in your relationship with him, which leads us to the importance of obedience. When you realized that you are saved by grace and not by obedience, you will actually be able to be obedient to Jesus out of love. Look at what Samuel says to Saul in verse 22. He says, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. The Lord doesn't want our lip service. He doesn't want our rituals, because what the Lord knows is that ritual worship isn't heart-filled. Obedience is heart-filled worship. In other words, the more you love someone or something, the more you're willing to be obedient to whoever or whatever that is. Are you tracking with me? Like you can see this in another teaching of Jesus in John chapter 15, verse 14, where he says, if you love me, you will keep my commands. What we're seeing here is this simple reality that the more you grow to love someone, the more you're willing to be obedient to them. I've experienced that in my own life. Like the deeper I get into relationship with someone, the more I grow to appreciate them for who the Lord has made them to be, the more I'm willing to do what they ask of me. And you've probably experienced that too. Like the deeper you get into relationship with someone, the more you appreciate them, the more you're willing to do what they ask, even if what they ask doesn't make sense. Even if what they ask doesn't benefit you, even if what they ask might cost you, you're still willing to do that because you love them enough to do so. Obedience is a way to say, I love you so much that I think you are worth this. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for us. Listen, you've got to realize that Jesus is the only human being who has ever existed that didn't have to be obedient to anyone. And that's not just because he was a perfect human being, it's because he's God. He's the second person of the triune God of the universe, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And so for all of eternity, Jesus wasn't obedient to anybody. Question, if you could go your whole life without having to be obedient to anyone, would you take that option? Like if you could choose to never be obedient to anybody, would you do it? I would, in a heartbeat. And yet, Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 tells us that Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient. He chose to be obedient when he didn't have to. Not only did he choose to be obedient, but he chose to become obedient to death. Not just death, but a horrific death on a cross. Like, do you realize that there's no way to make sense of that choice of obedience? Like, Jesus' choice of obedience cost him everything. He took on all the limitations of being human so that he could die a horrific death on a cross. Why? love. Because he loves us so much that he willingly chose to become obedient to death by allowing his body to be broken and his blood to be shed so that we could be redeemed. When Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commands, he's applying to us a standard that he has applied to himself. And so here's what that means just really practically for us this morning. True obedience does not come from a heart full of obligation or fear. It comes from a heart full of love. True obedience does not come from a heart that's full of obligation, like, oh, I guess I have to be obedient to Jesus. It doesn't come from a heart that's full of fear, thinking if I'm not obedient to Jesus, he's going to get me. A heart of true obedience comes from a heart that looks at Jesus and says, I love you. I love you because of who you are and what you've done for me, so much so that even if it doesn't make sense, even if it doesn't benefit me, even if it costs me, I will follow after you in my life. So allow me to ask you this. What I want you to do for a second is I want you to take out that cup you received for communion as you came in this morning. And I just want you to close your eyes. I promise nothing weird's going to happen. This is a little different. Just do this with me for a second. I want you to close your eyes, and I just want you to ask yourself this question. What does the level of my obedience to Jesus in my life say about how much I love him? If you look at your life right now, and you look at your willingness to overcome that difficulty of obedience, what does that say about how much you love Jesus? Is it equal or even close to the love that he has shown you by willingly dying in your place, by becoming obedient to death itself? As you ask yourself that, let the Spirit do his work. Let him bring to mind areas in your life where you're not being obedient, where you've given in to that difficulty, and when he does, own it, friends. Confess it before him right now to find the grace and the forgiveness and the strength that you need to move forward in the change that Jesus has for you. Father, thank you for the love that is on display at your table. We praise you for the grace that you've shown us, the fact that you have called us to yourself and you have given us a way to find salvation that isn't contingent on our obedience at all, which is what makes obedience so important. It's a way for us to respond in love to the greatest act of love that this world has ever seen. So I pray that when we fail, you would give us the ability to own it. I pray that if there's anyone here today that hasn't confessed their sin to you as their Lord and Savior, I pray that you would draw them into that relationship with you right now. And for those of us who have made that commitment to follow you, would you help us to remember that the best thing we can do when we're disobedient is to come to you and to own it, to confess that to you, so that in the forgiveness and the love and the grace you can show us, we can find the strength that we need to overcome all of the difficulty that comes with being obedient to you. Jesus, I pray that in my heart and in the hearts of my brothers and sisters this morning, that you would allow us to show an appreciation for your love because of how we're obedient to you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.